There's been a great deal of speculation as to whether I would run for president. And if I were willing to absolutely rule that out, I could keep doing this show. But I can't make such a declaration.
President Mike Huckabee has a nice ring to it if you're the aforementioned prior candidate who believes the time is right to launch yet another shot at the White House. As the new Congress gets to work, there's a need to start nailing down those who have a real shot at leading and those who are destined, for whatever reason, to be perennial followers. Let's welcome to MidPoint columnist for National Review Online, senior editor at the American Spectator, and contributor here at Newsmax. Always a pleasure to get the inside from John Fund. John, Happy New Year. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ed.
Let's get right to it because we're going to get to the Congress in a couple of minutes, but their work is just continuing now. Let's talk about the real fun stuff here, and that's Mike Huckabee, the latest to say, I'm going to go ahead and give it another shot. Honestly, John, is this someone that everybody should look at and say a real possibility, or is this just somebody getting involved, looking to present himself, but has zero chance of being president?
I don't think you can ever say zero. Mike Huckabee did extremely well in Iowa in 2008, and I think that any candidate who gets ahead of steam in the early primaries can conceivably build momentum. Having said that, he's clearly a distinct underdog. But you know, I'm glad that everyone is running this time, Ed, because in the past, the Republican Party had too little competition. It always gave the nomination to the next guy in line, whether it was George H.W. Bush or Bob Dole or George W. Bush or John McCain or Mitt Romney. So let's have an open and competitive race, which we haven't had in the Republican Party for something like 50 years, and let's hear everybody out, and the voters will make up their minds after they hear the debates.
Let's take the other side of that, because you make a good point, but again, when you have so many people involved, so many voices, so many ideas on why I'm the guy, why I'm the gal to get it done here, the American people sometimes seem to get lost in all this, John, and they really can't make a proper decision. They don't do the research on a lot of this. So aren't these voices and too many voices just going to muddle this picture?
Well, you'd be right if we had a 50-state primary system, all states voting at the same time. We don't. Iowa goes first, then New Hampshire, then you go to South Carolina, then you've got Nevada, you know, all parts of the country represented. Voters in those states are used to paying attention to the candidates, used to getting enough information, and used to casting very informed votes. So I don't think we have to worry about that. By the time those 4 states are finished, you're going to have the field winnowed down to 2, maybe 3 candidates at most. And believe me, the rest of the country can figure it out from there.
Is it fair to say that, at least in Mike Huckabee's case, if the evangelical Christians are the ones who truly, again, get behind him and let their muscle flex a little bit politically, that is the reason why he could become a real favorite?
It would be if he had the field to himself, but all of the candidates will have some evangelical support, especially Rick Santorum, who won Iowa in 2012 over Mitt Romney, largely by attracting the same kind of voters that voted for Huckabee in Iowa in 2008. So if both Santorum and Huckabee run, I think they may do very well in terms of getting a better TV gig and better speaking engagements and more notoriety, but it would diminish the chances of either of them going forward to the nomination or the vice presidency.
About a minute left before we take a break. 2 other candidates here. Jeb Bush has started a new political action committee. It would seem to be a fait accompli that he will run, but is he a good enough campaigner in order to become president? That seems to be the knock I'm hearing about him.
Well, we haven't seen him campaign yet. He hasn't been on the ballot anywhere since 2002. That would lead some people to say he's rusty. Other people would say, you know, let's see him perform on the stump. I'm not completely convinced that Jeb Bush is running. I think he still has to square some things with his family. But assuming he does run, we're going to know soon enough how rusty he is. And he's making all the right moves in terms of positioning himself for the nomination. He'll be an establishment choice, but he'll be probably the most conservative choice of the establishment we've had in decades.
30 seconds. How about Chris Christie? Oh, you're not a fan of the Eagles, I would hope, first of all.
You know, I stay neutral in those battles, and Chris Christie might have been wise to do so as well. Chris Christie has enormous support in the Northeast, but at the same time, he's governing a state which is very troubled. Atlantic City is collapsing. Unemployment is still high in New Jersey. He hasn't solved the pension problem there. I think Chris Christie is going to be judged in part by what he can do to work with the Democratic legislature to actually turn New Jersey around, because if he's running from a state that seems to be in decline, that'll hurt his national chances.
Yeah, hopefully not with the team he roots for. Hang on just a second here, John. Break will return to zero in on the first day of real work for the new Congress. That and much more coming up right here on MidPoint. Welcome back to MidPoint. Newsmax contributor and national affairs columnist for the National Review Online, John Funn, joins us again. All right, John, let's get down to the Congress and what's happening inside the Beltway today. John Boehner, a man desperately in trouble, clinging to his own political life. Please stop me before I put any more really ridiculous hyperbole involved in all this. Is it not fair to say that the Speaker will retain his position and may come out of this stronger than ever?
Well, John Boehner has a very tough task. He has to manage now 247 Republican House members who have a variety of points of view, come from all parts of the country. Naturally, there are people who are upset with him. And certainly, Congress has done things that are still an affront to good government, forcing members to read hundreds of pages of bills with only a couple of hours to absorb them before they have to cast a vote. Those things are inexcusable. Having said that, John Boehner does not have a really serious alternative candidate running against him. He has two candidates who are fine as members of Congress, but have never run a committee, have never been in charge of a leadership post before. I think they're running to express the frustration of some conservative members that Boehner has cut them out of the process at times. So Boehner survived 2 years ago when he only could afford to lose maybe 18 members. Now, of course, he can afford to lose almost 30, so he really isn't in jeopardy. And if he wins with it convincingly and actually convinces several members who voted against him 2 years ago to vote for him now, he's already won over 3, then he will be perceived to have actually improved in political strength.
What then would be his next move, in your opinion, John? Let's just say that, as expected, he will be reelected to the top spot. And you've got people such as, you mentioned, Louis Gohmert and Ted Yoho, who have said they want to become Speaker. They're the alternatives here. But then what happens to the infighting? Because now he has his enemies identified. He can now work against them. He can now, and let's be very honest, we know this happens in the political world, he can punish those who came up against him one way or another. Give us an idea of some of the infighting that may go on now once this is all shaken out.
Well, once before, he helped maneuver several members who opposed him off of certain committees. I don't think he's going to do that again. I think he's going to try to have a collaborative effort. And the real change in the dynamic here, Ed, is the Senate. You could always say about John Boehner that, you know, whatever the House passed was going to die in the Senate. Harry Reid sat on bills for months, never had votes, never allowed amendments. So you could always say that what Boehner was doing in the House was the best he could do, knowing that the legislation wasn't going to go anywhere. Now he's going to be judged by a different standard. If something passes the House, it needs bipartisan support in order to probably pass the Senate with the 60 votes needed to quell a filibuster. Then I think conservatives have a right to demand that the legislation reflect their values and their principles, but at the same time, moderates in the Republican caucus have a right to demand that the bill is something that will get some Democratic votes in the Senate, because the goal here is to put more and more legislation in front of President Obama and force him to either veto it, which will show him to be the liberal that he is and damage some Democratic congressmen who stand with him, or reluctantly sign something and some conservative principles will be actually enacted into law.
Fair to say that they want to get as much in front of him as possible before autumn of 2015, because they want to get everything here and start to set that agenda before we actually start getting all the distraction of presidential voting.
Well, it's certainly true that major pieces of legislation rarely pass in a year ending with an even number, because that's always an election year. There are exceptions, but in general, the real goal of passing legislation that means something, that's more than just naming a post office, is going to happen in the next few months. That's why this Congress, this session of Congress, is going to be so important.
We've got about a minute or so left here, John. How vocal and how verbose at times would you expect members of the Tea Party to be?
Well, again, I think the Tea Party after 5 years is a misnomer. There's no membership in it. Anybody can declare themselves a member of the Tea Party. There are a lot of outside groups that may or may not speak for the majority of Americans who support those principles. The bottom line, though, is the Republican Party now has a legitimate wing of the party which is going to be very insistent on not going with business as usual, demanding real change, real accountability, and that's always going to chafe up against the political realities as the leadership sees them. But I'm glad we have that tension, because that's the kind of tension that you have in a party that's bidding to be the majority party, because the major arguments happen within the majority party, and if you don't have any arguments, it means you're probably a minority party, and the Democrats increasingly look like that minority party. They don't seem to have learned very much from the 2014 election meltdown.
John, you're one of the few who got it right on the head. Tension sometimes is very good when it comes down to governing a country, and certainly inside the Beltway. You got that right. John, thanks so much for your comments, my friend. We'll look forward to the next time. All right, take care. After the break, what could be a blockbuster legal decision if a member of the Ferguson grand jury is allowed to tell all about what went on behind those closed doors. And in telling it like it is later on this hour, Chris Christie isn't the problem. It's the knuckleheads who choose their president by what football team they root for. It's coming up right here on MidPoint.